Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of the Ignatius College in Budapest and as well the Catholic University Pázmány from Budapest. I have been working in Brussels and in different research locations. So I try to sum up perspective of the Hungarians of the transitional justice questions, maybe with somewhat less data, but as a third presentator maybe it's also an advantage. And then we will have a glimpse on the Visegrad countries, so the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland as well. I really would love to join the words of Peter Rosic when he was trying to decipherate how actually the transitions moment were defining everything that came later. And in this, actually, Hungarians have a very special experience. You see that the Iron Curtain is being dismantled. Hungary later has been praised by Germany for years that we opened the Iron Curtain and we let the East German refugees through Austria to West Germany. Actually, at that moment when the photos were taken, not this one because you can see that this is the real curtain, but then when the state secretary was cutting it open for the Germans, then they had to rebuild some of that for the sake of the photo because it was already open. So some of the pictures are actually artificial pictures that you see later. So it's really difficult to see how the transition actually was ongoing. And at that moment, even months can count. Hungary was proclaiming its republic on the 23rd of October in 89. And in those years, in that year, neighboring countries had very different stories to tell. The Czech Republic or the Czechoslovakia was breaking up later. Actually, it was in November and December when the Velvet Revolution, as we call it, started. Or Ceausescu, if you remember that pretty awful Christmas with the images of the execution of Ceausescu on the 25th of December. It took a while. So Hungary and Poland was already in flames, in symbolic flames, happily, while these other countries were pursuing their track on a much slower or very different track towards democratization. Everything that Peter said, I agree with. I just want to put the large picture on that. Lustration is one thing, and then there is the extremely interesting question that you put, why we didn't install tribunals or international tribunals or anything else to prosecute people that were torturing or enabling the torture of other people during decades. The Nuremberg trial and the Tokyo trial after the Second World War, these were trials that we can dispute on many different bases, but at the end of the day, they proved to the population that those who commit something will be prosecuted. And this is a basic experience that most of our transitional countries lack from the beginning of the regime change, because we couldn't prove that people who commit something simply will be brought to justice. And this kind of negative incentive still has effects on our societies. And then comes frustration on top of it, whether we can open state archives or not. Probably former East Germany is the most exemplary in that, opening everything that was left behind after storming the Stasi headquarters. And Hungary is one of the worst examples because even the right-wing party did not vote in favor of opening state archives. Several times did not vote in favor of that, even when it was on government and even when it had constitutional majority. Why? Because already these political allies, of course, comprise several members of the former state security or those being head on top of the communist parties. And till today, in Hungary, no one can ask for the files on anyone else but on him or herself, meaning that he would receive a duly censored file without the real names of those who perpetrated the state security networks. So this fault of lustration, of course, is still a factor for blackmailing and political bargaining, if you want to put it in another way. The three prime ministers that the post-communist party, which is called socialist today in Hungary gave to the country. The first of them was someone who was actually fighting against the revolutionaries of '56. The second one was a paid member of the secret police with the name of D209, who was fighting against capitalist regimes and his own country. And actually the third one was a person who married into the family of the former head of the KGB in Hungary. These are prime ministers in a transitional country well after the regime change. Why? Because actually we just failed to draw the line that perhaps someone with these kind of posts should not enter into politics. Of course, we have other problems. When files are not open, it's a problem. And when files come too early, it's also a problem, and that's called WikiLeaks. But this is the issue of another presentation. So, how individual and institutional relations influence trust in our countries? Of course, it is very evident that trust is artificially maintained at a very low level in dictatorships. That's what the Soviet ideal tried to recreate in our countries through binding citizens to state and not citizens to each other, to families or other circles or civil society as such. Then, and this is really interesting in the light of the data set that Miro brought, it's an extremely interesting research, and I will refer you to different researches that I thought relevant to this question. It's Hans-Dieter Klingemann from Germany, who was researching whether we trust institutions or democracy as a form of institutions, a set of institutions. And when we have a problem with the functioning of our political life or of the political quality of life, then what do we say? Do we mistrust democracy, or we mistrust those working in democratic institutions? And this is a major difference, whether we actually say that if my government is not good, then democracies should go to hell and let's take another form of political governance, or, as that would be the major reply, and Germans did reply in that way, then it's not about changing democracy, but changing parties and changing government. And if there is no party that I like, then I take the responsibility to build up a new party. Shall it be the Piratenpartei or something else that we politically may less identify with? But still, it's a huge difference whether we want to get rid of the form of governance or those being on power. Of course, the formal institutions in post-communist countries lost trust in a very quick way. Still, there are plenty of books explaining how the Romanian network of secret police, the Securitate, survived. We all know that Iliescu was not without a past in Romanian state security. Still, he was having Romania for a certain time. We also know that Vladimir Mečiar in Slovakia, whose son was kidnapped in the middle of the 90s. These are all episodes that remind us how long former networks could survive. But just to give you another Hungarian example, a counterintuitive example, how much the old trust questions were overridden already in new democracies. And I believe Slovenia is also divided, this is a valid fault line, communist and anti-communist feelings. In Hungary, that was the case till 2010. What happened then? The right wing, for 20 years, have been the most outspokenly anti-communist parties in the country, and of course the left-wing and post-communist party were not outspoken or even in favor of some former cadres. Then, in 2010, when the right-wing government took on power, suddenly they changed position, and for the sake of an active foreign policy measure, namely to enter in a better relationship with Russia, they dropped the anti-communist rhetoric from almost one day to another. So it's very strange that those who have voted for this right-wing party Fidesz for 20 years, who among the members, they have plenty of those whose property have been nationalized, who have been sent to gulags, who were the real victims of the communist regime, suddenly, through communication measures, could be convinced a huge majority to vote for the same party, which is changing rhetoric for the past and for the future relating Russia. The Russian question is, of course, in a very different way interpreted in Hungary than in Slavic countries. So trust is changing in this way, but let's go to more interesting data sets still. I have brought you this, well, the group doesn't exist anymore, but it's just a photo of the feelings of Visegrad countries at a certain moment 10 years ago. And it is interesting for me because it is showing how much history is saying or has a say in which institutions different countries put their trust. So how much, for example, the church is trusted in Poland, 70%. And why is it so low in different countries? Well, the Czech Republic has its own history, but still in Hungary the church was so much infiltrated by the state agencies. And lustration was so lacking in Hungarian church still today, that of course it was not becoming the major actor of the transition. Then the government trust. Slovakia among the Visegrad countries is a curious exception. It is still trusting its government, and in the data sets usually he's still playing very good, while other countries already 10 years ago, 2 years after the European Union enlargement, had their doubts. Local authorities, the role of the president is very different in the countries, and of course what Miro said with the political parties, we find it again validated in other data sets as well. Political parties simply are terrible players of public trust, but this is the same in the United States. I remember a one-digit number of trust in the Congress on Capitol Hill by the US citizens. So these are just reminders how much history is influencing our transitions and how different even these small countries might get on this track. The solution, how we actually try to raise trust for the new institutions of democracy can come from the outside or from the inside. So it might be an individual motivation that I want to build something, and I may start a civic organization for animal rights, or I may enter a church and go on missionary travels, or I may simply organize the street in my hometown and arrange the trees on the side. It doesn't matter. It might come from the inside, from the individual motivation. Which is more varying, and it's also a special Hungarian case when we expect help from the outside. So we rely on someone else for my own trust in different institutions. This is the same Eurobarometer that Miro was showing in one of his slides. And this is from the last year, so 2015, and it shows the difference how Czechs, Hungarians, Polish and Slovaks are trusting the European Union. And you remember that Hungary and Hungary's Prime Minister had extreme debates with Jean-Claude Juncker, with different commissioners in Brussels, and well, Hungary is not having the image of being the most EU-friendly country. Still, our population last year already was trusting the most the European institutions. Why? It is not because Hungarians love Jean-Claude Juncker, definitely not, because he was slapping the Hungarian Prime Minister on occasion. But they like it because this is the Hungarian paternalistic social reply to where I am expecting help from. And if I cannot deal with my own government, because, well, I won't go into politics, that's the reply of most citizens, so I'm expecting something from the outside, and it's much better to expect that, well, then the European Union will fix it. Then the NATO will fix it. And we had a huge debate about Hungarian-American relations in 2014, when Americans were forbidding a couple of state officials entering the United States on charges of corruption, on suspicion, of course, it was never brought to trial. And then Hungarians said, well, or half of the Hungarians, of course, said that the United States will teach a lesson to the bad government. They did not want to be in charge of their own government, and this is a returning pattern for Hungarian democratic forces, political and civil as well, to go to Brussels, to hold public hearings, to go to the US, and try to fight back in these very long ways to the real Hungarian questions without trying to deal it directly at home. What is still interesting, that the Hungarian government has been communicating in, well, very diverse ways about the European Union. And you see that Poland, with the Kaczynskis and Pisz, is also not the most EU-friendly country. Still, the population is not influenced by that. Actually, the trust in the EU institution in these countries fall the most after the economic crisis in 2008. So the lowest level was measured usually in 2009. People were not directly affected by political communication, because half of the country is not listening to it. If you take the turnover rates or participation at referendums or direct elections, people simply don't care. They feel the economic needs what they have, and then they reply more to that. All right, I won't go into details with the migration crisis and the comparison with the banking regulation after 2008, but that might be an interesting point for debate later. Let me come to my last factor which I wanted to introduce for the question of how much we can trust each other and how we might be empowered to build institutions. Why am I bringing income inequality into this perspective? Of course, we need resources to build civil society. We need resources to do anything if we want to start something else than just living from one day to another. The Gini coefficient is measuring the income gap or income inequality in countries. And it's really interesting to see how much the Gini coefficient has been worsening in Hungary, or, well, this is the same trend usually in Eastern and Central European countries, usually with 2009 again, making a bit better numbers and then starting the trend again. The problem, if income distribution is getting more unequal, then of course a certain part of the society is left behind. And this part of the society might have very skeptical opinion on the rest or on the part of the society which is dealing with the authority. So when we see that income gap is growing to a level, a more and more unsustainable level, of course this might be a problem. And you can read excellent reports that the Visegrad 4 exports grew 3 times more than the EU 15 states in the last 10 years after the enlargement. You can see how much the GDP has grown, even per capita GDP in Poland was doubled. So there are excellent statistics regarding economics, and of course economists like to project it per capita, while it is not distributed per capita. You are not receiving your per capita GDP part at the end of the year, but everyone is receiving a quite different part of it on a curve that the Gini is showing. But it's not my point. My point is the next slide. And this is the Edelman Trust Barometer. And the difference between the blue and the green column is that they were asked whether they trust institutions. This is a global statistic. They were asked whether they trust institutions. And the high-income respondents, so the elite of the society, is the blue one, and the low-income majority of the society, usually it's like 75%, which is falling into this category of the respondents, is the low-income green column. And you see, and this is explaining, I guess, or at least in my eyes, a lot of the Trump phenomenon and many other things, that the gap between the social levels of trust in our own institutions is growing and is extremely large. So while we, the elite, is trusting its own institutions, either because we are in charge, or because we understand, or because we believe we can influence it, that's rational, but masses of people are not trusting their own elites and institutions, and this gap has been growing significantly in the Western world as well as by our countries. So traditional political fault lines, in this case, might be blurred much more quickly. That means that it's not anymore left and right, or as I put the example in Hungary, it's not anymore communist or anti-communist lines. People can become and be turned into anti-establishment feelings very quickly. And this is what's happening. That they are not anymore about how I can connect to a certain part of the elite, and then, let's say, I'm a Catholic anti-communist person supporting this part of representatives in my country, but I am more quickly turned into anti-establishment, just as it is happening with AfD in Germany, or certain supporters of probably the Republican candidate in the United States. So this is a very, very dangerous trend which is going on, and I think that we in the Central European countries can still face it in time, as income gaps are still lower than in the western part of Europe. Finally, let me just show the last slide. Who else we trust? And this is, of course, you can ask it in very different ways and might get somewhat different answers. But the good news is that the trust in academic experts is still very high. But then comes companies, and the trust in business is actually growing larger than trust in governments and public institutions. Then comes the employee CEOs, and here is our journalists. Trust in journalists decreasing, so it is last year and this year, as well as online personalities, so typical reality or other celebrities are falling in the same category with elected officials. So this is showing that people's trust networks are being reshaped over time and over the social media and with the new means of communication. This is driving us to an extremely volatile time of trust networks and collapses of trust in otherwise long-time, well-established institutions. So to come to my conclusion, what I wanted to explain was that there is a velvet revolution effect which is actually still undermining the public morality because of the lack of lustration and Nuremberg-type trials in our countries. The problematic of self-help, that people still don't feel empowered enough for their own reasons in our countries. And there is the paradox question whether we can centrally empower people to act against the central power. This is, well, not so easy to answer. And finally, there is the question of economic hierarchy in the society, whether it can be compatible with democratic trends lately, or whether income inequality is driving us necessarily to very stormy times. I hope that Slovenia is also finding answers to these questions, and I hope that we will have some more excellent questions from you. Thank you very much.